a second mega trend that I think your followers should look into or be aware of. It's everything we've just discussed has a lot further to run in what is called basically the developed world, Western Europe, US, and all the usual suspects. And when you look at what until recently was primarily classified as emerging markets, and I mean nowadays the terminology is all over the place and it's politicized as well, so no one really knows anymore what to call it. But if you go to Africa or India and a bunch of other countries along those lines, the penetration of technology is at such at a much earlier stage. I recently wrote an in-depth research report about the mobile phone penetration in Africa, which is, I mean, first of all, you've got over 50 countries there, so there's no generalized way of talking about Africa because it ranges from South Africa, which is obviously quite a developed economy, to countries that are just recovering from civil wars even. But generally speaking, it's a bit like traveling back in time by 10 to 15 years. But developments take shape much faster. And in these countries, quite often with much higher profit margins, because these markets are difficult to access. They're very intransparent. You have to be a local entrepreneur to understand them. So if you succeed, all of a sudden, you may be in a market that is smaller or has less purchasing power, but your profit margin is much higher because competition is not that intense. And extraordinary fortunes are going to come out of that. And I can only recommend to look at technology investments and online related investments in, I'd say, across Africa. That's definitely one of the most interesting ones. I'm not an expert on India, but my gut feeling tells me that India has a lot further to run. The numbers are just absolutely staggering, and they are, to put it bluntly, so far behind that there's so much opportunity for catch-up potential. And I would definitely put a lot of emphasis in my research on that for the 2020s and look at the question of what are going to be the national champions in these countries. I mean, in Poland, you've just seen the IPO of Allegro, which is the Polish version of Amazon. And very few people nowadays remember that Allegro was actually part of a London-listed investment company in the early 2000s, when Allegro was basically more or less a startup. And that investment company went bankrupt, and Allegro was sold to some private equity companies. And it's very hard to come to find figures about all of that. But I've worked out that probably compared to the value of Allegro 20 years ago, when you could buy it on the London market, the value of that has risen by about a factor of 10,000.
Wow.
And that's now a national champion in Poland. It's absolutely insane. And there will be other such opportunities in other less developed countries, because the Poles don't buy on Amazon, they buy on Allegro. And in Russia, they buy on, I think it's called Ozon. And, the list goes on. And we'll see more of those. There'll be a lot more of those.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, as you said, there's less competition and more of a working, especially India. They have 20% of the world's population, plus they have, I think, the highest proportions of people in the working age, and that's all massive tailwinds for emerging markets. And internet just adds a layer on top of that and makes everything scalable. So who knows, maybe they can come up with even better innovations than the Western world.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
We will see more and more cases of innovation that you would have expected to come from Silicon Valley all of a sudden emerges elsewhere, which is wonderful, and creates opportunities for finding value in unexpected places. I mean, let's go, without going back to fiber yet again, but that's coming out of Israel. It's not coming out of the States. Not New York, not Silicon Valley. It's Tel Aviv.
Tel Aviv, yeah. Israel is an amazing hub for innovation. I mean, they've got fiber, Wix, as you mentioned, and they've got a few more as well. And again, so when you're really good at spotting trends, especially with fiber and the emerging markets, as you said. So what is your process for spotting trends, and what resources do you typically use to spot such mega trends?
So I'd love to give an easy answer to that. Sadly, there is none. The obvious one is always you just have to read a lot. And I believe it helps a lot if you have a system of keeping notes or keeping files about all sorts of subjects. Because if you have an ability to occasionally refer back to what you've already collected, then your brain starts to make connections that wouldn't have been created if you just had read something and then put it away forever. And there are various systems for that. And I recommend everyone develop the system that works best for them personally to keep notes and an archive. And then what happens over time is that some of the folders you keep will just inevitably end up with lots of material in it. And then you can say, okay, subject XYZ now has 50 articles in it, and I'll spend an afternoon reading up about it, because you just develop that sense that all of a sudden something that you had a
Mhm.
little bit of an interest a year ago might become more relevant. And then you have a critical mass of material to read up about, to educate yourself. And I think then it's a bit of an organic process of your brain also learns to intuitively lead you to the subjects that you should pay more attention to. Immerse yourself in information, but don't just do it randomly. Do it in a way where you create a little bit of a system and you help your brain to tune in to the areas that may become more interesting in the future. And it's an acquired skill. There's a really good book that I wanted to mention to your
Yeah,
listeners.
please do.
Um, it's called. It's got a long title, which is why I printed it out just to actually get this one right. It's called Non-Obvious Megatrends: How to See What Others Miss and Predict the Future. From a guy called Rohit Bhargava, who has been publishing an annual series of books about non-obvious megatrends. I don't think the book sold particularly well. I've never really seen it anywhere except for one random bookshop in Washington D.C. where I like to go. Speaking of bookshops again, I do like to go to bookshops where I can physically like touch books and rummage through the shelves, and you find stuff. And then I bought a whole bunch of his books, and in his books he doesn't just give lots of predictions, but he also explains how his process works. And I
Right.
think there is a lot to be learned from him. He does it in a fashion that is easy to replicate, and he's very good at explaining it. So that's one of my book recommendations, really. And to just add one more reading recommendation, if I may,
Yeah, go
I
for
think
it.
a free e-letter that your listeners would enjoy is called Exploding Topics.
Exploding topic.
It's a newsletter and an information service that basically tries to identify subjects that are just on the cusp of becoming better known, and they want to be onto it a bit earlier. So, I mean, the title is somewhat misleading because Exploding Topics is probably they're trying to find topics before they explode. It should be called Emerging Topics That Will Soon Be Exploding Topics, but that's too long a title for a newsletter. They have a subscription-based service, but they also have a free weekly e-letter, and I take great joy in reading that regularly and seeing what they've got on their radar.